Welcome to the Upper Room, and we're so glad you've joined us on this early spring or late winter day in western Colorado. And our setting does matter, but we'll get to that in a little bit. In the summer of 1996, I think I might have mentioned this a couple lessons ago, I was with led a group actually of 15 of us to Ukraine, to Kherson, Ukraine. And it was just 4.5 years after the fall of the Soviet Union. And that comes into play here in what I want to tell you about. So we got ready to go and we decided we need to have some t-shirts. We all wear the same t-shirts, at least on the airplane, at least when we get there, kind of identify us as a group. And so we came up with these t-shirts and we had someone design them and put Russian or Ukrainian words, they're very similar, but Ukrainian words on the t-shirt. And so I want to show you this t-shirt because it really is playing an important role here. You can see we have the American and Ukrainian flag, and this particular t-shirt I had signed by a lot of the people that we were working with at a particular camp where we worked for about 10 days out of the 3 weeks that we were there. So I think you can see it, right? And you get the gist of it. Well, whoever put the t-shirt together did a little research and just came up with basically the words that we're going to do a Christian camp. Minor detail here, but the word camp that this person chose to put on this t-shirt just so happened to be the exact word that was used for the young pioneer camps of the Soviet Union for all those years. Between 1922 and 1991, they would take young people to these camps, and there were something like 40,000 of these camps in the Soviet Union. And you probably guessed by now, these camps were not just about learning how to fish and hunt and hike. These camps were Marxist propaganda camps. The goal was for the young people to be trained, and Lenin started it. The young people were to be trained in Marxism. And so as you can imagine, 4.5 years after the breakup of the Soviet Union, that word was not a real popular word anymore in Ukraine. So we show up wearing these shirts and we're so proud of them. And as soon as we got there, the missionary looked at our shirts and said, "Oh no." And we said, "Like our shirts? They're cool, aren't they?" The front says, "Choose Life," and we're celebrating Americans and Ukrainians doing youth camps together. He said, "Oh no, this is not good." We asked him, what's the problem? I mean, did we misspell something? Do we have the wrong flag on there? Did we make that kind of mistake? And it's then that he told us, the word you used, the Ukrainian word on your t-shirts, is not a good memory for these people. They are not happy about all those generations that were brought up as young people being brainwashed into Marxism. Now they are experiencing some freedom, and now you're going to take them back to that. I tell you that story because, you've heard the phrase lost in translation. And there really is something to that the translation from one language to another can be very tricky. And I can tell you from the times I taught there and preached there that some of the things I said, especially some of the jokes I told, did not translate very well at all to the Ukrainian people. But it happens in life, doesn't it? So our little mishap in Ukraine reminded me of one of my favorite stories. And it was back in the day when public restrooms were not real common around the world. And so it was a real concern if you're going to travel. And as the story goes, this British woman was going to go to India. And she was going to stay at a schoolhouse kind of facility that had some bedrooms and some apartment type things. And she was concerned as to whether there would be bathrooms there. So she wrote ahead of time asking about this, but as you may know, the British, at least they used to, call bathrooms water closets. And she was such a kind of a bashful person that she didn't want to say the word bathroom in her letter or the word water closet. So she simply wrote her letter to the headmaster of that school asking about the WC. Well, when the headmaster in India got this letter from this British gal, and he came to the abbreviation WC. He had no idea. He didn't speak English, so he took it to the priest, and the priest said, well, I'm not sure about that, but she's probably done some research, and she probably knows about our area. She's probably talking about the Wayside Chapel, the WC, the Wayside Chapel down the road about, a bit. And if she has a place there that she can go be a part of church. And so basically that made sense to both the priest and to the headmaster. And so they returned the letter. The headmaster returned the letter. And I want to read the letter to you now that you know the context. Dear ma'am, I take great pleasure in informing you that the WC is located 9 miles from the house. It is located in the middle of a grove of pine trees, surrounded by lovely grounds. It is capable of holding 229 people and is open on Sundays and Thursdays. As there are many people expected in the summer months, I suggest you arrive early. There is, however, plenty of standing room. This is an unfortunate situation, especially if you are in the habit of going regularly. It may be of interest to you that my daughter was married in the WC since she met her husband there. It was a wonderful event. There were 10 people in every seat. It was wonderful to see the expressions on their faces. My wife, sadly, has been ill and unable to go recently. It has been almost a year since she went last, which pains her greatly. You will be pleased to know that many people bring their lunch and make a day of it. Others prefer to wait till the last minute and arrive just in time. I would recommend that your ladyship plan to go on a Thursday, as there is an organ accompaniment. The acoustics are excellent, and even the most delicate sounds can be heard everywhere. The newest addition is a bell which rings every time a person enters. We are holding a bazaar to provide plush seats for all, since many feel it is long needed. I look forward to escorting you there myself and seating you in a place where you can be seen by all. And he ends the letter with warmest regards, the schoolmaster. I'm guessing the British lady didn't make her trip to India. Lost in translation is a real thing, isn't it? And there's a reason I wanted to talk about that, because we are in the midst of a series we're calling The Lucky Ones. And The Lucky Ones is about the Sermon on the Mount. In other words, we are so fortunate, number one, to have the Sermon on the Mount, the talk by the sea, if you will. But more than that, when you get to the Beatitudes, they all begin with blessed, or blessed are you, blessed are they. And that word again literally means how fortunate, how very fortunate. And so we've translated that into how lucky I am. Okay, again, not the kind of luck about, going to a horse track or, going to Las Vegas, but how lucky I am. And then we follow through with what Jesus says. We are so fortunate to know and to live. And so that's what this series is about. We started in Matthew chapter 5, verse 3, where Jesus says, blessed are the poor in spirit. We described how that means spiritually bankrupt, just absolutely understanding your need for God and how you can't go on without Him. And then we described how the Beatitudes, in God's wisdom and Jesus' incredible teaching style, they build on one another. So once we come to an understanding of how needy we are for God, the next Beatitude is blessed are those who mourn. It only makes sense that a great sadness will come over us when we realize our need for God and how we cannot do this life on our own, and we really are in a difficult, if not impossible, situation without Him in our lives. So now that we've covered Matthew 5:3, Matthew 5:4, we now come to Matthew 5:5, and as you can imagine, it builds on those first two Beatitudes. But here's my concern, and it takes us back to the lost in translation. I'm going to read to you from 7 different translations, and I want you to see that there's a word in this Beatitude that is translated differently almost every time. And it makes you wonder, what's going on with this? And in fact, it's true that the translation does not always come through as it ought to, and I want to make sure that we get the right understanding of what Jesus is saying. And when we get to that point, I tell you what, I'm so excited to share with you what he actually means there. So let's begin verse 5 in the NIV, the New International Version, and it reads this way: "Blessed are the meek, they will inherit the earth." Let's go on to the New Living Translation, where it says, "God blesses those who are humble, for they will inherit the whole earth." The New Century Version puts it this way: "They are blessed who are humble." Then the New American Standard Bible says, "Blessed are the gentle, for they will inherit the earth." Now let's go to the Amplified version, and you can imagine that this gets a little lengthy, this one short verse, because they like to describe something in using many words. So I'll read it to you. "Blessed are the gentle," in parentheses, "the kind-hearted, the sweet-spirited, the self-controlled, for they will inherit the earth." I guess they could put in parentheses that round planet, but they didn't. A little different. Now let's move on to the ESV, the English Standard Version, where they say, "Blessed are the meek." Now we've heard that before, haven't we? And then finally to the Message, which if you don't know what the Message is, it's not really a translation. It's more of just a paraphrase in modern English language, which I find helpful oftentimes. You might find helpful. And it says, "You're blessed when you're content with just who you are, no more, no less. That's the moment you find yourself proud owners of everything that can't be bought." And those are 7 of the most often used translations. I didn't use the King James. I forget what King James says. But basically we end up with 2 humbles, 2 meeks, 2 gentles, 1 content with who you are, and the Amplified, kind-hearted, sweet-spirited, and self-controlled. Okay, I've given it to you. Discussion question. Again, I'm guessing you haven't researched this, so it'll be interesting to see what you think. Which of those translations or versions do you think might be the most accurate? Okay, you might be saying, "Steve, does this really matter? Which is the most accurate?" We get the basic idea. It really does matter, because Jesus chose words, and again, he probably was speaking Aramaic, but the closest Greek word to that was written down is really important, because there's special meaning behind everything Jesus says. Again, he doesn't do anything randomly. He doesn't do anything off the top of his head, not give much thought to it. So it really does matter. And so we come to the Greek word, therefore, all those words that were used, meek and humble and gentle and kind-hearted and all those things. And I'm going to give it to you. And before I give it to you, I want to tell you, it is one of my favorite words in the Bible. There's a lot of fun words, but my favorite Greek words in the Bible. And the word is prautos. Prautos. And wherever you find that word, it's often translated gentle, but the most accurate rendition of prautos is meek. So if you guessed meek in a couple of those translations, I think the NIV had meek, then you guessed right. Meek. Now the problem with the word meek is we don't use that word very often, right? In our modern English, we tend to think of meek as being weak, which those two have nothing in common. And so we need to delve into that word and the definition and the meaning of that word to better understand what are the implications of this simple sentence Jesus spoke there on the north side of the Sea of Galilee. And so the word meek is what brings us to this location here behind me. We're in the Cimarron Valley, and behind us is an old barn and corrals where I guarantee you, whether they still do it in the summer or not, that in the past at least, horses were broken here. They were trained here, okay? They still might do it, but it's that kind of a setting that supplies the meaning for the word meek or prautos in the Greek. Now, my history with horses is not good. I don't have a great history. You might call it a checkered past. I've been thrown off most horses I've been on, and I could go into all those amazing stories. Probably the worst was when I was a little younger as a kid, and I was on a horse and it was just out of control. It got out of control fast, and I didn't know what to do, and I was screaming for help. I was trying to get someone's attention. Finally, my mom or dad heard me screaming, ran over and unplugged it. And then we went on into Walmart. Yeah, those were the days when they had horses out there. I guess they got too dangerous, like that one almost did for me. Anywho, the point is this. We're in this place because behind me, at some point in time, horses have been broken. What does that mean? It means they've been ridden and trained, and they were wild at one point, right? They were absolutely out of control, doing their own thing, and they had to be what they call broken, brought under control, all right? The Greek word for that having happened with a horse is prautos. So in its purest definition, the word prautos means to really bring a horse that's a wild horse under control. It's also used, or was used amongst the Greeks as a salve that heals a wound. Isn't that interesting? A salve that heals a wound. Something that's painful, but there's something very simple that can be done to bring out the disease in a wound and heal it. And finally, it's used for words that calm strong emotions. You know, some words can be said to bring somebody who's kind of out of control emotionally under control. Okay, so that's the context. So the word literally means power under control. In the context of what Jesus is saying, we could say it means having the infinite resources of God available with the ability to show restraint. Isn't that interesting? See, that's a lot better than humble, right? Isn't it? I think it's a lot better than humble. It's a deeper word. It has deeper meaning. Humble, you know, you hear of humble pie. He really got his humble pie. You know, he's shut up now, you know. Or if you see someone who you say they're really humble, you think, oh, shucks, you know, I didn't do that much. You know, that kind of thing. It's much deeper than that. And I want to take you to the book of Esther. In fact, you don't have to turn there, but you probably know the story of Esther and Mordecai, who told Esther, you've become a queen in this pagan country, and a pagan king made you a queen for such a time as this. Now, what was that time? It was the time to go before the king and take a stand that he act on behalf of her Jewish Israelite people. Okay? Circumstances were going on that we won't get into, but he said, this is why you are queen. That's why he chose you. Don't think God doesn't have his hand in this. You are to go now to him. And her response is really interesting, you know, because it was well known that a king, if you aren't summoned by the king, you could die. Let me read to you from Esther 4:15. Then Esther sent this reply to Mordecai. Go and gather together all the Jews of Susa and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days or nights. My maids and I will do the same. And then, though it is against the law, she's the queen. Think about this. Maybe we should institute this in our marriages. Maybe not. It's against the law. I will go to see the king. If I must die, I must die. Wow. You'd think it'd be no big deal for the queen to stroll in and go, yo, king, you know, yo, husband, you know, you got to help my people. She knew it could be instant death if you're not summoned by the king. I tell you that because that was an understanding that you and I don't have, because we don't have a king. Okay, we're getting close to having a king, but we don't have a king yet. And you have to be summoned or put to death, most likely. It is that regal, that royal power that kings had, and they do have. And then for that king to show restraint, which, by the way, her husband does show restraint. And you can read the rest of the story. It's a wonderful story. But that's my point. What we're talking about when Jesus says, blessed are the meek, is regal restraint. That is, someone who has ultimate power and strength and might, showing control, under control, the breaking of a horse, a mighty horse, the horses that would gallop and run through these pastures, and at some point they'd need to break them and bring them under control. Again, a very beautiful word, and that word has a powerful implication for our lives. Okay, I want to break this phrase Jesus used down into two different areas, if you will. So the first area that I want to delve into is something that you've heard before, and that is that appearances can be deceiving. Now the problem with that is that we all want to be significant, and in the world in which you and I live, the culture in which you and I live, it's all about appearances, right? It's all about the impression you can make. You see, I'm not sure that you or I can truly appreciate how often we attach significance or the value of a person to their appearance. And we do it all the time without even thinking about it. We describe somebody as she's cute, he's big, he's small, he's thin, he's fat, he's bald, he has a mullet, he's dark, he's black, he's white, he's brown, he's, you know, name it. We describe people by appearance, and by doing that, we often attach some kind of a value to them. And the problem with that is that appearance then becomes always attached to significance. My significance is based on how I appear to you. You know, maybe it has to do with my work habit or the kind of wealth I've accumulated, and you can see that kind of wealth. Whatever the case may be, it's kind of a dangerous thing that happens because without us knowing it, our significance and our value and our worth is attached to things that sometimes we can't control. Let me give you a couple examples of that. Way back when I was a kid, there was a guy that played in the NFL by the name of Lyle Alzado. If you remember him, he played for a time with the Broncos, the Browns, and the Raiders, and he was known as maybe the toughest, meanest, bad guy in the NFL. He really was. They actually have a rule in the NFL based on him. You may not know this. You can't take someone's helmet off, rip it off their head, and throw it. You're not supposed to do that. They didn't need that rule before Lyle Alzado. I'm just saying. That's the kind of guy he became. Everybody was afraid of him, but he was an all-pro 3 times. He went to the Pro Bowl twice. He won a Super Bowl. So this guy was a significant player in the NFL in the 70s and 80s. But then all of a sudden, I didn't hear about him for a while, and an article showed up in Sports Illustrated. And this article that was written in the summer of 1991 was actually written by him. And they had a picture of him on the cover. I'll never forget it. And he was not the same guy. He was weak. He looked old. He had a bandana on. I want to read an excerpt from what Lyle Alzado wrote about his life. He's dying of cancer, of a brain tumor. And here's what he writes. And by the way, he will die 15 months after he writes this article. Just a little bit from this to describe how his persona, how his value has changed since becoming ill. He writes this: "Everyone knows me as a tough, tough guy, and I've never been afraid of anything. Not any human, not anything. Then I woke up in the hospital last March, and they told me you have cancer." Cancer. I couldn't understand it. All I knew was that I was just so weak. I went through all those wars on the football field. I was so muscular. I was a giant. Now I'm sick, and I'm scared. It wasn't worth it. Sure, I played 15 years as a defensive end with the Broncos, the Browns, and the Raiders, twice made All-Pro, but look at me now. I wobble when I walk and sometimes have to hold on to somebody. You have to give me time to answer questions because I have trouble remembering things. I'm sorry I lied. There's his confession that he told people he would have nothing to do with those kinds of drugs, but now he believes it was those drugs, those performance-enhancing drugs that gave him this tumor. I'm sorry success meant so much to me. I just got married to a beautiful, beautiful woman, and I can't take her dancing. I can't take her to dinner. My strength isn't my strength anymore. My strength is in my heart. Lyle Alzado had to change what he believed was important about life. You could say that he became meek, right? All that power that he exerted on the football field, and some of the things, his stories of how he treated people and how he beat people up in the streets, you know, all that changed, and he became this weak individual with no strength. But is that meekness? I would propose to you that it's not true meekness. Yes, his power came back under control, but it was forced on him. It wasn't chosen. I want to give you one more example. Ronald Reagan, many of you remember him. I believe he's one of the greatest presidents we ever had. His term ended in January of 1989, and for the next 15 years or so, he would live a retired life, but it wasn't very long after he left office that it became obvious that he had Alzheimer's, and he wrote a very incredible letter to the American people about his discovery of having Alzheimer's disease. The story I want to tell you is a story I read years ago about a man who was living in Los Angeles, the Los Angeles area, with his young son, and they're walking through a park, and he looked over on the park bench, and he saw a man sitting there, stooped over, that he recognized. It was Ronald Reagan. After talking to him for just a little bit and having his son there, they left, they shook hands and left. And he stopped with his son, maybe several yards away, knelt down and said, I know you don't know who that is, but that man, that weak elderly man that had a hard time even speaking to us, was once the most powerful man in the whole world. It's a sign of meekness, or is it a sign of weakness? So in a world where our significance is tied or attached to our appearance, performance for sure, Jesus comes along and shows us what meekness looks like. We go to Isaiah chapter 53, verse 2, which predicts what Jesus would look like. Are you ready? He sprouted up like a twig before God, like a root out of parched soil. He had no stately form or majesty that might catch our attention. No special appearance that we should want to follow him. That's it. That's all there is to tell us about the physical appearance of Jesus. And it comes hundreds and hundreds of years before he actually comes to the planet. In other words, purposely, it seems, the Gospels never tell us, never want to attach a value to Jesus based on his stature, based on his appearance. It is turning the culture upside down, is what it is. For a culture like ours that is dependent on that appearance to find significance, it seems as though he purposely chooses to have nothing about his appearance that would draw people to him. And by the fact that the gospel writers never mention his stature or appearance, tells us there is something much more important than our appearance by which to attach our significance. Because for Jesus, his significance was not about that. It was about the kind of person he was. And we're going to find out meekness was what he was all about. If you've ever read Philip Yancey's book, The Jesus I Never Knew, he goes into great detail regarding research about the typical Palestinian man of Jesus' time, of his era. And we've mentioned it before, and I love this. He says the average guy, and we believe from what Isaiah says that Jesus was really typical, the average guy stood about 5'2". Isn't that great? 5'2", just typical. Again, if he was 5'2" in our culture, people would think, oh, he's not much, right? I mean, the smaller in stature, we always evaluate people and love to be attracted to people who are tall, dark, and handsome. That wasn't Jesus. Okay, that's important because the meekness of Jesus now shines. It's not about what you and I would first imagine and what we'd first be drawn to. So let's now focus not on appearances anymore, but on the character. And there's this character trait of meekness that shines through Jesus that I think he is proposing. This is how you do life in the kingdom. We define meekness then as the ability to access God's infinite power, but yet to stay under control. And I want to ask you, when did Jesus display that power? Did he really have access to that power? Can you think of some times when he displayed that power? I don't think I have to give examples. You gave a lot of examples of the power Jesus displayed, whether it was with raising the dead or healing the blind and the lame or turning water to wine, and it goes on and on and on, calming the seas. His power was on display, and yet what I want to show you is how often he restrained it. The King of Kings, the Regal one, had restraint. Matthew chapter 11, verse 28, a passage we love to quote. I want you to see something in there that just screams meekness. Jesus says, "Come to me, you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am praus." That's the word. I am gentle. we get the word translated as gentle. It is the word meek. I am meek, he says, and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. He says, I have access to all the power you could ever imagine, but it's all under control. It's all restrained. Paul writes about this, Philippians chapter 2, verse 6. Though he was God, speaking of Jesus, he did not think of equality with God something to cling to. Verse 7 goes on to say, instead, he gave up his divine privileges. What is one of those divine privileges if it's not absolute power? The absolute king of the universe, absolute power. And he didn't think that he should hold on to that so he could show us what life would look like in his kingdom. Instead, it says he took the humble position of a slave. He signed up. King of Kings, all-powerful, signed up to be not just a human, but be a slave amongst humanity. 2 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 1, Paul writes, I, Paul, appeal to you with the gentleness and kindness of Christ. He now describes Jesus as gentle and kind. Again, the word is prautes, literally meek. I appeal to you based on the meekness of Christ, the unbelievable power, but yet its restrained nature of Jesus. Let's go to Luke chapter 9, verse 51. As the time drew near for him to ascend to heaven, Jesus resolutely set out for Jerusalem. He sent messengers ahead to a Samaritan village to prepare for the arrival. But the people of the village did not welcome Jesus because he was on his way to Jerusalem. When James and John saw this, they said to Jesus, Lord, should we call down fire from heaven to burn them up? And in some manuscripts, it goes on to say, as Elijah did. Guess where they just came from? They just came from the Mount of Transfiguration. Who did they see up on that mountain? They saw Jesus, of course. He was the central figure. But with him was Moses and Elijah. It's fresh on their minds. And so they stop in this village in Samaria, and they're told to get out. You can't stay here. And they say, hey, we just saw Elijah. Remember what Elijah did? He called down fire from heaven on the prophets of Baal. Let's do that, Jesus. Can we do that? Let's unleash all power and destroy these people. And yet in verse 55 we read, but Jesus turned and rebuked them. That's meekness. Could he have called fire down from heaven? Out of anger, of course, but it's under control. It's restrained. The regal restraint of Jesus is on display. Remember, Jesus is in the Garden of Gethsemane the night before he's crucified with his disciples, and they come to arrest him. And remember what Peter does. Peter pulls out a sword to try to take on these guys. And Jesus says in Matthew 26:52, put away your sword. Those who use the sword will die by the sword. Don't you realize that I could ask my Father for thousands of angels to protect us, and he would send them instantly? But if I did, how would the scriptures be fulfilled that describe what must now happen? Thousands of angels. In other translations it says legions, 12 legions in fact. You know what that comes out to? The Roman soldiers, when they're in legions, that all comes out to about 72,000 angels. Jesus has put the sword away. I could call down 72,000 angels. I have that kind of power. And they'd mow these guys down. But what is Jesus saying? But my Father's will is more important than me exerting my power. That is meekness. Isn't that incredible? Power under control. Question, not a discussion question, but just something to ponder. Do we have access to that power? Here we go. We're going to go through a lot of scripture. Jot it down if you would. Maybe your leaders can give it to you ahead of time so you have it in front of you. Ephesians chapter 1, verse 19. Paul says, I also pray that you will understand the incredible greatness of God's power for us who believe him. It's for us. What's the word? Dunamis. It means dynamite. It also means ability and might. Power that we have the potential to tap into is the idea. That ability to tap into the mighty hand of God, the mighty power of God. He goes on to say, this mighty power, that same dunamis, that same might and ability that raised Christ from the dead and seated him in the place of honor at God's right hand in the heavenly realms. That power raised him from the dead, blew the stone, the 2-ton stone, up a hill, and it also elevated him from the earth to the right hand of God. That is available to us. Ephesians chapter 2, verse 18. Now all of us can come to the Father through the same Holy Spirit because of what Christ has done. We now can come to that Father and access the power of the Father. Ephesians 3:20. Now all glory to God, who is able through his mighty power, there it is again, at work within us to accomplish infinitely more than we might ask or think. It's there. It's available. That kind of power is there for us. To be meek is not to be weak. We have access to God's infinite power. Romans 8:11. And if the spirit of him who raised Jesus from the dead is living in you, he who raised Christ from the dead will also give life to your mortal bodies because of his spirit who lives in you. The same spirit that power flows through lives in us. So you and I have access to the infinite power, the resources of God. But how do we manifest it? How do we restrain that power in our own lives? Let me give you some examples. Acts chapter 3, verse 9. All the people saw him, that is the lame man that Peter and John had healed, and they saw him walking around praising God. When they realized he was the lame beggar they had seen so often at the beautiful gate, they were absolutely astounded. What kind of power could heal this guy? They all rushed out in amazement to Solomon's colonnade, where the man was holding tightly to Peter and John. He wouldn't let them out of his grasp. It's what a scene. He's holding on tightly to them. Peter saw his opportunity and addressed the crowd. People of Israel, he says, what is so surprising about this? Why do you stare at us as though we made this man walk by our own power or godliness? For it is the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the God of all our ancestors, who has brought glory to his servant Jesus by doing this. How did they show restraint? Interestingly, they used the power. They showed restraint by saying, it wasn't us. It's not our power. It's the power of God that we access. 2 Timothy chapter 1, verse 7. For God has not given us a spirit of fear and timidity, but of power, love, and discipline. So never be ashamed to tell others about our Lord. We have the power. How do we manifest it now? By telling others about him. James chapter 5, verse 16. Confess your sins to each other and pray for each other so that you may be healed. The earnest prayer of a righteous person has great power and produces wonderful results. How is that power manifested through us? In our prayers. We can powerfully pray and ask God to do a work, and wonderful things happen, James says. Finally, 2 Peter chapter 1, verse 3. By his divine power, God has given us everything we need for living a godly life. That's how it's manifested, by living a godly life. You and I cannot do that without the power of God. We have access to that, and yet it's restrained by the fact that we use it for prayer and for a godly life and to bring healing to people. Peter and John did it physically. We do it through prayer, through counseling them into a life that they didn't have before, possibly. Do you see how it's manifested? It's manifested in a way that we don't bring honor to ourselves, but honor to God. Okay, so appearances can be deceptive, can't they? We know that. But now, instead of us depending on our appearances, we now access the power of God. That's the life of a meek person. Very different than a weak person, right? We are anything but weak. Not only are appearances sometimes very deceiving, but our inheritance is very much rewarding. Now we get to the second part of what Jesus said in verse 5. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. What is this about? We've talked a little bit about this in the past, but you got to know that, you see a movie like Rain Man or Knives Out, many other movies and stories where inheritances are granted to people and they talk about them. I've never actually been in a room where I got read an inheritance. That'd be cool. But I'm gonna be. I'm going to be in the throne room of God someday, and our inheritance will be bestowed to us. Let me show you what it looks like. This inheritance is not vague, obscure, or something that we can't get excited about. Let me take you to Isaiah 65, verse 17. Look, I am creating new heavens and a new earth, and no one will even think about the old ones anymore. What do we inherit? What did Jesus say? They will inherit the earth. Not this one. This is a pretty cool earth, but it is unraveling. It's falling apart, right? The law of entropy. Beautiful horsefly peak behind me. It's falling apart. But we have a new earth coming that we will inherit. You want to do a fun thing? We're not going to do it, but you can do it. Go to Isaiah chapter 11 and read verses like 1 through 6, 1 through 9, and you will see in there what the new earth will be like. And it actually says in verse 6 that a child will sit and be amongst the most ferocious animals on that new earth, and yet he will lead them. There will be a relationship where there will be no animosity, no killing, no downside between relationships with the meanest animals in this earth and a child. A child will lead them. That's meekness. 2 Peter 3:13, we are looking forward to the new heavens and new earth he has promised, a world filled with God's righteousness. Revelation 21:1, then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the old earth and the old heaven had disappeared. John is talking about what he's seeing and what we will inherit. Who is it that will inherit all of this? The meek. Those who have access to the infinite resources of God and yet show restraint. We don't make it about us. We always make it about him. And the things we do show his great power flowing through us. A little bit more about our inheritance. This is so fun to talk about. Romans chapter 8, verse 14. For those who are led by the Spirit of God are children of God. That's you and that's me. The Spirit you receive does not make you slaves so that you live in fear. Rather, the Spirit you received brought about your adoption to sonship. And we cry, Abba, Father. The Spirit himself testifies with our spirit that we are God's children. Now, if we are children, then we are heirs, heirs of God and co-heirs with Christ. He will bring us the new heaven and the new earth, but we inherit it. We get to reign over it. I'm going to read that passage in the Message. This resurrection life you receive from God is not a timid, grave-tending life. No, it's adventurously expectant, greeting God with a childlike, what's next, Papa? God's Spirit touches our spirits and confirms who we really are. We know who he is, and we know who we are, father and children, and we know that we are going to get what's coming to us, an unbelievable inheritance. Isn't this fun? Being meek is not being weak and feeble. It is having access to everything that is God's, and it's ours, and yet it's all with restraint. We don't have to brag. We don't have to be brash about it. We don't have to make it about us. More on inheritance, Ephesians chapter 1, verse 11. Furthermore, because we are united with Christ, we have received an inheritance from God, for he chose us in advance, and he makes everything work out according to the plan. Verse 14, the Spirit is God's guarantee that he will give us the inheritance he promised, and that he has purchased us to be his own people. He did this so we would praise and glorify him. Do you see that? Why do we have this inheritance? Why do we have access to the power of God? So we will praise and honor God, not so we will make it about how we appear to people. And finally, 1 Peter 1, verses 3 and 4. Now we live with great expectation, and we have a priceless inheritance, an inheritance that is kept in heaven for you, pure and undefiled, beyond the reach of change and decay. This world, as we've said many times, is changing and decaying. People are panicked about it. Climate change. Oh, we need to run your life because there's going to be climate change. No, God predicted it. This will change. It will diminish. But there's a world coming that you and I can look forward to. Do you talk much about your inheritance? The meek will inherit the new world, the new heavens. I can't wait. I hope you're so excited about that. That's the life. That's the reward of those of us who take on that meekness. That meekness is the exact characteristic that Jesus lived out on this earth, and now we take it on. The meek are not what they appear. Jesus appeared to be a nobody, and yet he had the infinite power of God at his fingertips, under restraint, under control. I want to circle back as we close one more time to this thing about Ukraine and our trip there so many years ago now. Right now, you may or may not realize that tanks and soldiers have come into Kherson, Ukraine. They actually now own that city, a fairly large city. The wilderness area that they had to run through, plow through, was a place where we did that camp that I talked about in the beginning. I want you to think about the power and the might that has been displayed by the Russians as they moved through that area and made the people fearful and distraught as they plowed through there. And I want you to picture if we could have had a drone back in the days where we were in that area doing that camp, and that drone flies in and it doesn't see tanks and soldiers with power showing off that power. Instead, you see a circle of people, and many of them are children, and in the middle of that circle is a clown. His name is Rob, and Rob was from Alaska. We met him there, and we did this camp, and some of the children that joined us in this camp were from Chernobyl. Yes, they were around the age of 10. It was 10 years before, in 1986, when Chernobyl erupted, and the results were that the poison that leaked out brought cancer to so many people, and those children all had cancer from living near Chernobyl. What I want to tell you is this: Rob, the clown in the middle of our circle, was bringing laughter and joy to these children on that day. I can remember it like it was yesterday. I tell you that because that, my friends, is meekness. Power under control. It was the power of God working in and amongst those children, bringing them joy that they would soon experience as they would pass from this earth and experience the ultimate power of God to heal them. It is not the power of tanks and soldiers of a foreign army that really we should look at and be in awe of. It is the power of God under restraint in the form of a silly clown that brings joy to these kids. Aren't you excited about this idea that God has said that once you have come to that place of sadness because of your state without God, that now you understand you actually have access to his power, and it all is under control. It's not out of control, harming people. That was the life of Jesus. That is the life he's called you and me to. God bless you as we journey through the Beatitudes, the beginning of the Sermon on the Mount. How lucky are we? How lucky are you to have access to God's infinite resources, and yet it's all under control. Thanks for joining us.